kind of feel like this conversation was really crazy.
It was a good conversation.
What did you think? Madam, we're rolling.
What do you consider your first mature piece of writing?
Oh, you know what's so interesting about that? I want to know if you feel this way, but I'm kind of only interested in the thing I'm like working on right now, or the thing that I've like just finished. So I just finished this long essay I've been talking about for years about watching Dana Schutz make a sculpture.
Right.
And so to me, I'm like, okay, this is my first mature essay.
But this is book length, though.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, in the art world, yes,
Yeah.
it's book length.
That's something you talk about too, where like the catalog essay as a form is something that is unique in so many different ways, that nobody really gives you that space to kind of elaborate ideas, and you can go deep.
Well, I think, in some ways, I'm sort of chagrined to be talking about like art criticism, because what most people think of when they think of art criticism is like reviews in the newspaper or in an arts magazine. And I don't really write them. And so it's a little weird. Most of the things that I write are in this kind of hidden place, which are like for artists' books and catalogs. And partly it's because you get paid the most money and you have the most freedom.
Right.
And you can do something weird and imaginative. It's also a very different, it enables certain kinds of writing and thinking, and it closes down others. I think that the kind of thinking that it closes down is the kind of thinking that most people associate with criticism, which is evaluative in the sense that it's like, this is a good painting or this is a bad painting. Like de facto, because it's for an artist's book, like you're not making those kinds of distinctions. I actually don't know if those kinds of distinctions are very interesting, period, but they're just not very interesting to me.
They're quick. I feel like people like them because you get a rating on something and if you can respond to it quickly. Like if something has 5 stars and you think it should have 1, then you've started the shit that you want to start. Whereas if something's really long form and it asks something of you and is creative in its own right, then you don't have something quippy to say. You don't have something for conversation or something that fills your day. And I think a lot of times people are just looking for something to fill their day.
Well, there's like a different level of buy-in, I think, where it's huge. Like, oh, I'm gonna read a book-length essay about Dana Schutz. It's like, okay, like it means that you care about art and all of these kind of ever narrowing intersections of like that kind of specialization that you're like going to commit to it, to like think about it. And one of the things that's interesting to me about what you're doing with NewCrits and like with the art school crit as a model is I think the purpose of the crit to me is very related to the purpose of the kind of writing that I'm interested in, which is that our ability to perceive something is not neutral. It's not like a given. It's like consciousness is like a muscle, or like our perceptions are things that we exercise, we train, we focus, we learn to expand. And so it's really hard to even engage or see what something is. Like if you walk into an exhibition or you walk into someone's studio or you walk into someone's home and you are confronted with something, it really takes a lot of time to open yourself into understanding it. And that's why the kind of up-down criticism, or not even up-down, but kind of like opinion-based criticism. It's like, I don't like that.
Yeah.
It's like, cool, like who cares if you like it or not? Like,
what was the first moment that you started caring about art in that way, where you made that investment? You read an essay and you were like, this just changed my shit up.
Because I was always a no-chill queen.
Okay.
When I was like 16 in North Carolina, I saw the Ingmar Bergman movie Persona.
Oh, so good.
And I was like, faggot. I was like, I didn't know, I was a painter and I didn't know that like a film could be an artwork. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like where it's just like images. and that the images were a form. Like, and the thing about that film that's so good for someone who is young is it performs, it directs you to think about all the things it's doing on the level of form. Like it starts with a projector and the history of the images, and then you see the screen, and it's
an autopsy on itself.
But it's an autopsy that doesn't come to any set of conclusions. In fact, what it does instead is it lays out a bunch of mysterious opportunities to engage with without resolving themselves in any stable way. And so, you know, I didn't know anyone. It's not like I had friends in high school in North Carolina who like wanted to talk about Ingmar Bergman. So I was like, did what I always do, which is like I went to the library, I found like the local college library, I found a book that the British Film Institute put together, which is like an anthology of criticism on persona, and I read all of them.
Wow.
And I don't know why people think it's crazy when you just read a book, but like we live in a world where like that is kind of crazy, but it's like, I don't know, I read the book, and the essay in it that I thought was the best essay was by someone I had never heard of, named Susan Sontag. And I was like, wow, like this essay, it describes every single thing that I noticed about this film for myself. And it opened it up into a higher level of thinking without explaining it. And because we know now, because I didn't know then, but because it's that period of early Sontag where she's doing against interpretation, in fact, it's enacting this text in which the erotics of the artistic experience or the aesthetic in and of itself is the bearer of the meaning, in which you can't explain away. And in fact, your like impulse to explain it away is like this completely despicable aspect of what she hates about criticism at that time. So I read that essay and I was like, wow, like this person did something in talking about this that I didn't know you could do, which is like make you love it even more.
I mean, it's like, I feel like it's in a sense like getting to know a person, because the more you know about them, you might have fights, you might have disagreements, you might have all these other things that happen, but in the end, it's intimacy that develops and something that can be rich, but it doesn't explain that person away. Like, I don't think any intimate relationship I've had, there's always some kind of mystery still. People still surprise me, even in how horrible they can be.
I think that's very touching and probably true.
There's a lot of love in your writing. Like anytime that I read your writing, I feel how much you love either the work of art that you're discussing, even if you hate some parts of it, or even if you can be catty about some parts of it, there's still an immense amount of love. And then when you are talking about other critics or the kind of history of criticism, likewise, it's such a endearing love for what it brought you to. I mean, you wrote a book like this big, or you edited a book of interviews that I refer to it frequently. Like, I think about it all the time.
Well, that was the basis of us starting to talk, actually. Like, we had a drink about that book. And that was so cool. In fact, it was probably one of the only conversations I had with someone, who really wanted to go in.
Oh, wow. One, I think maybe when I went to Columbia, I went for art and art history. And my 20th century, freshman year, my 20th century professor was Benjamin Buclot. And like Rosalind Krauss was teaching there, and Jonathan Query was my 19th century professor. It was like a who's who of art historians. And so for me, it was a real nerd out session where it brought me back to a moment of like digesting material that opened up art in a way that I didn't know was possible, that you could materialize ideas in ways that didn't objectify, even though you were making an object. It still held mystery. It still held something that felt like a conduit to something else. And you cataloging that of like a best of, where all these people that are bringing these kind of universes of thought and holding them in a book, it's like it gives such a reverence to that as a form that I was just really intrigued that somebody would do that, first of all. And like, it felt like a fellow traveler too.
Well, I mean, I think what the basis of our ongoing conversation is, among all of your talents, I really love your writing. And I guess I probably knew your writing about art in tandem with knowing your your visual art, but before I knew you. And so, yeah, I think that's like what we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's what we've been talking about. But now you have these 2 new projects, and I read the introduction for one of them, which is your, I guess, a compendium of essays of Dave Hickey's. So it's a new anthology. Is there anything that's been like, that's never been published before, or this is all stuff that's like kind of coming
it's all
together again?
Stuff that's been published in different, most of it kind of obscure contexts, but some things have been collected in a book, but most of it is new. And
then you have your own book, which brings me back. I guess you mentioned really briefly that you started as a painter.
Yeah, I went to art school.
Okay, I want to get back to that. I want to mention the title of the book is Valid Until Sunset.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the title a little bit?
Yeah, the title of what it means to write about art, I was telling you earlier, was so complicated to try and find a title for, because there are 30 critics and 30 writers who are very, very different. And so you had people like you had mentioned, like Rosalind Krauss or Hal Foster. And then you had poets like Eileen Myles or John Ashbery. And then you had kind of belles-lettres critics like Hilton Als or Dave Hickey, novelists like Siri Hustvedt or Lynn Tillman. And all of those people have very different kind of like projects and think of themselves differently, and they function very differently. So it was very hard to find a title that could hold them all together. And so it ended up with this very default title, What It Means to Write About Art. And I remember when I told Dave Hickey this was the title, he said, well, Jarrett, you really scratched the bottom of the barrel on that one. And I was like, yeah, I know. But there was also a thing where I was like, I wanted people to be able to find it, you know? I wanted young people to be able to find it, people who were interested in the topic. And so it had this like very dumb title where it's like, okay, you can find it now, like the lowest common denominator. And I have to say, the interesting thing about that book is it's really moved out into the world. Like it's like a book that, I mean, just yesterday, someone from Brazil emailed me asking if they could translate the interview in it with Darby English into Portuguese.
Damn.
And I was like, yes, you know, like, yes.
Awesome.
So it really kind of, and I think maybe the dumb title kind of helped it going around. Like without a more kind of glamorous or opaque title, it might not have been as accessible outside of our world. And so I'm happy about it. But you had asked me a question about
the title of your new book.
Oh, Valid Until Sunset. Okay, so I vowed to myself, I'll never have a book with a bad title again. As God is my witness. And so I keep a list of ideas for titles of things all the time through like my reading or things I hear people say. There's just like, oh, I think, okay, that's a title. I have these things. These are titles for things. I don't know what they are, but you know, I've got the next few years covered for titles. And so one of those moments was a few years ago, I was in Miami at like the gay nude beach in Miami, which is Hallover. And there's like a section at the end where all the gay guys are. And in the parking lot, there was a period where the parking slip that would come out that you put on your dash said valid until sunset with the date. And I was like, wow, like this is like a little poem like in the world. Like, wow, this is a title for something. But I never, I should have kept one of those slips because now they've changed, which is already like perfect for the thematics of it. But so for years I thought, okay, valid until sunset. And I think for a while I thought it was a collection of essays. And then when I started working on this book project, which had to do with an experimental writing in relationship to these photographs that I'd been taking for years and years. And then I realized that kind of the constellation, the emotional and intellectual constellation of like what that book was about, the writing in relationship to these images. Some were photographs of art, but some were photographs of like other things. Some are photographs of like flowers on a table. Some are like naked people having sex, like whatever. I was like, oh, that's valid until sunset, because also the thematics of like light, and it's a lot about mortality. I had all these friends that died. And yeah, so that's where the title of that came from.
What is your relationship to I don't want it to be so broad as to say what's your relationship to writing and death, but is it something that, because looking through those entries and including the images as well, I think I was surprised at the near religiosity of it.
Yeah. Well, I would say that one thing one might not know, if your understanding of art came from studying with Benjamin Buchloh and Rosalind Krauss, is that for most of human experience, the majority of the things that we call art that have ever been produced were produced within a context of religious belief and ritual and ceremony. And so I think on a certain level, that's how I respond to it.
Yeah.
That's also something that I'm not scared of, like, letting be in the room.
Yeah.
More than anything, I think I'm interested in opening up the aperture as, like, wide as possible in terms of, like, how one might write about art, what art could be, how we could relate to it. Because for me, that's all what art's really about, is like how to be a human being, like how to live your life on this earth together. And so I don't want to prematurely cut anything out of it, because that means that, first of all, like, why? like why take away from you, like, you know, like something really beautiful?
Yeah.
As like part of like what might be present in any given moment of your life. So yeah, I think there's a lot of God stuff in there too.
There is, yeah. I mean, of course, like your introduction, it begins with the sudden death of your father, and bearing witness to that, bearing witness to the moment, understanding what it might mean to bear witness in a time that nothing makes sense and everything's upside down. And as it followed and as the entries followed, you know, I remember you were talking about the fig tree, and I was like, oh, like this deeply, profoundly embedded religious symbol of the fig tree, and how it's like kind of falling to the ground and opening up and rotting and kind of having ants and all these other things that felt indifferent to a human picture. And you could feel that there's decadence and rot and religion and beauty and death and life all sort of intermingling in that moment, that I imagine was somewhat true to how that experience was kind of unfurling and unraveling. And like the images that follow, the one that struck me the most, the one that almost felt like strangely, I don't even know what to call it, but it was the picture of Simone Weil's tombstone.
Yeah.
And it said, I do not in the least wish that this created world should fade from my view, but that it should no longer be to me personally that it shows itself. To see a landscape as it is when I am not there. When I am in any place, I disturb the silence of heaven and earth by my breathing and the beating of my heart. For an art critic, that...
Well, I talk about her with Darby English, actually, in that interview, because he, the essay that he wrote on, very great essay he wrote on Carrie James Marshall about the painting of the cop, he writes about her essay on the Iliad and force and the operation of force to transform a subject into an object. And he does a whole reading of that painting vis-a-vis her. So I would say, like, there are art critics like doing it. But
no, it's not to say that it can't, like, that it can't be involved, but it's the...
But I would say, like, my relationship to her work, which I read when I was like a teenager, and as I said, also No Chill Queen, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I like artists. I'm very interested in art that is pushing itself to embody an extreme experiment as a way of trying to open up this structure that we're in, you know, like how to understand it differently. And she really is one of these incredible limit cases of like, how far can you think? I mean, she's one of the smartest people who ever lived. And because of that, she knew that being smart wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
Like, that's like, you have to leave being smart here to get where she wanted to go, which is over here.
Right.
And that kind of wrestling, that rigor, it's so devotional, you know? And I guess it's like the religious part of it is like, yeah, she's a religious thinker, but that's one of the things historically that like saints do, right? Is like they're like pushing their understanding of like what can be done into like this very far place. And so I'm sort of interested in saints, like temperamentally, and like, you know, they're not like us, but in ways that they also kind of are. But I don't know, it's like another part, a leitmotif of that book has to do, in a way, the framing is about my father dying in like a sort of dramatic way. But I had a number of friends that died leading up to it. And one of them that I feel like is one of the real armatures of the book is my friend Genesis Peorage. Mm-hmm. And Jen is another person who embodied that for me, like what it meant to like really question, like really make your experience into a question where you can like just open an aperture like a little further than what you've been given. And, you know, I think like I quote a lot like Diane de Prima, who like famously said this thing, there's only one war, and it's the war on the imagination. And I feel like that is very true in every aspect of our world right now. But when we want to diagnose like what's going on in the art world or what's the problem with art writing or whatever, for me, it's that. It's like, it's a war on the imagination. It's like, we could imagine this. It could be literally anything we want it to be. Like writing about art could be anything. So why is it like this? I mean, art's about every aspect, or art can touch every aspect of human experience and in its very unique way. So why is it the space where we try and engage that as like deeply as we can, why is it like it is right now? And so to me, that's a failure of imagination. And part of my problem with the forms of reviews is that it closes the aperture. Like in order to go into it, you already accept so much about what the parameters are, about the like who you're writing for, what can be done in it, how long it is, how you, what's the kind of language or the kind of voice that's permissible within that space. So that's one of the reasons why I always felt like, not that I believe in reviews still, but one of the reasons why it's not for me is that like I'm over here trying to like, you know, do something else. Yeah. And I don't necessarily have the gifts for that particular form.
I can't even. It's hard for me to imagine you writing a review. It has to be breaking something open.
I think that art writing is such a big category, and I think there can be people who write about art who are like very negative and, you know, material and like whatever, and be valid as like people who write about art. And I think that there could be art that serves very different functions.
Sure. Okay.
What I can talk about is the things that I am interested in.
Of course.
And what I'm interested in has to be about, on some level, being free. So that's not necessarily about like a painting that's about balancing like a red rectangle against a blue rectangle, but it could be.
Sure.
You know, that's what's so weird about it. Yeah. Is that I really care about attending to what things look like, but things can like look similar and be completely different. And that distinction is like one that has to do with like, maybe that's where I get into like religious stuff or something, but like, I don't know. This is where like all my credibility is going down the drain. But
that's not at all what I thought you were going to say. Like, how is that related to religion, where two things that look similar can be ultimately divergent?
I think that there is something that I like. Okay, so with art, there's all this complexity where it's like you have the artist who is making a series of decisions, some of which they are conscious of and some of which they are unconscious of, which produce this thing. Yeah. And then you have the thing which exceeds them. It's connected to them, but it exceeds them and it's different. And if it's a good artwork, it's smarter than them. and they can only partially understand it, and you can understand it in your way, your partial way, and through that triangulation you can learn something both about what it is to be an artist and what their intentions are, what the artwork is, and then like who you are. Like that's kind of the central triangulation of like my work. But beyond that, there is the art world that this person functions in, which it's like the socioeconomic dynamics of the personality and its performance in the world, and the production of a commodity and how that's functioning within a particular geopolitical system. I don't really deal with any of that stuff. And I think that that stuff is valid for people to deal with.
Right.
Other writers do it. But unfortunately, it's like most people who are writing now, that's all they're dealing with. They're dealing with that outside stuff.
How do you, I mean, I'm sure that you've written about artists that are thinking geopolitically, though, where the work itself is...
Yeah. But the difference is like, I think that, you know, in that interview book, I mean, I've been thinking about Roberta Smith today because she retired from being the chief critic at the New York Times. And when I talked with Roberta for that book, she made this very beautiful distinction that's so elegant, where she said this is the difference between subject matter and content. So everybody talks about content now, but what they're talking about is the subject matter, which is like the thing that is like visibly illustrated in the text, in the object. It's the thing it's about. So I'm actually not that interested in, when I said the thing about the red versus the blue rectangle, that's like a subject matter thing where it's like, but that's not what it's really about.
Right.
And so like you can have a video piece of like orphans deconstructing Barbie dolls, and you could have an abstract painting, and they might both actually have the same subject, but they perform that content differently. And so the content for me is like the meaning that exists for the thing beyond its, both as a material object, but not limited to that. It's not an illustration of that.
It makes me want to ask you more about political artists.
I'll just say no comment.
What do you think, like Francis Alice? I'm going to shoot some names out.
No, I'm not doing it. No, because the thing is, okay, but I'll tell you why. Because I think that I think that to be a critic is a very specific thing. And I really kind of bristle at calling myself a critic, but I think it's true. And it's because the way I think about it is, if you're going to write criticism, it means that you're putting yourself in a place of radical present, of contemporaneity with another artist. And that means that you are both subject to the limitations of your own awareness of your historical condition. And so I think that I think every great writer on art and every great artist, there are these magical things that happen where they kind of connect, like they're meant for each other. That there's something about what this artist is doing and thinking about at the level of form and at the level of like all of their interests, but also somehow slightly beyond that, that there's a writer who is the person for articulating that, for seeing it, and in that articulation, they're doing not only a gift to the audience, who can then learn how to understand this thing or fall in love with it or believe in it, they're doing a gift for the artist, because the artist can learn about it too. Dave Hickey on Ed Ruscha, that's a magical connection that basically no one will ever write better on Ed Ruscha than Dave Hickey. They can write something really smart, they can write something that's really incisive, but Dave was the critic who was able to touch on the full current of what Ruscha was doing, I feel.
When's the last time you felt that way about that kind of marriage of critic and artist?
I mean, I felt like that in this piece I just finished writing on Dana, where I thought like, I'm the person who wrote this. And
I love that.
When I finished the draft of this thing, I looked at my partner and I was like, I don't even know if this is necessarily good, but I know that no other person in the world could have written this. And I was like, that's good enough for me. You know what I mean? Like,
I'm sure that's not true. I feel like your standards are extraordinarily high. It has to. I think for you, it has to reach a kind of spiritual height, that it's touching something that you didn't even know you were reaching for. Because the artwork's doing that. The artworks that I feel like you want to engage with, or the artists that you want to engage with, are reaching for something that maybe they're not entirely sure they're reaching for, and therefore criticism has the gauntlet's been thrown. You got to reach too.
I'm interested in art that looks very, very different.
Yeah.
And it functions very differently from each other. I think the kind of unifying thing that really attracts me is, I mean, Lisa Yuskavage said this thing to me once, it was really early on, where we were talking about the way that she kind of organized her day or her week or something. Everything was organized prioritizing her being at the studio. Mm-hmm. And it meant that like she would do all of her meetings on like one day of a week, and that she would never do lunch meetings with anyone. And she said to me, you have to live your life in a certain way to make a certain kind of art. Mm-hmm. And it was like, boom, yes. What's interesting to me are artists who are prioritizing, who have organized their entire life in such a way that they are able to make this particular kind of work that's the work that they have to make. And that can look really different. You know, that could be a very minimal abstract painting, or that could be like a figurative sculpture, that could be a lot of different stuff. But it's like, I guess there is a way that I really respond to real commitment, like a real holistic, kind of almost maybe like devotional, because look, this is, to me, this is not a game. You know what I mean? This is like my life, you know? It's like, and it's your life. Yeah. And it's like, so that's one of the things that's so weird to me about like bitchy, cheap criticism and reviews, where it's like, okay, yeah, one could say something amusing that would be mean about someone's sculpture, but that person, you know, invested a lot of their life into making that thing. And the truth is, it's hard to make art. It's just as hard to make bad art as it is to make good art. Very and true. Most art is bad. It frankly just is. So I don't know how helpful it is. It just feels so unkind. In order to be a critic, as opposed to a historian, maybe even for a historian, but in order to be a critic, I think you need to have close ties with the community, with the context. And if you're an art critic who doesn't know any artists, mm-hmm. who doesn't know the way artists talk to each other about other work, both historical and contemporary, and about what it means to make in their studio, I just think that there's like a real hard cap on your ability to say anything meaningful mm-hmm. about art, because artists are the ones who make art history, because they're looking at, the work of the future is what makes something important. It's like, so if you're not listening to what artists care about, you're not paying attention to the way the game is changing.
How do you think it's changing?
Oh, the problem is that I occupy a like kind of hard advocacy position. So I'm always, the thing that where you said about, it was very, very kind of you to say that when you read things that I write, that it's, you feel that it's about love. Because I think that's true. Partly because otherwise, I don't think it's necessarily worth my time to write about something that I don't love. But there are things that I write, that I think about, that I have complicated relationships to, and I'm interested in thinking about that. But the writers that have meant the most to me, who were part of my personal life, were like Dave Hickey and Peter Schjeldahl. Mm-hmm. And both of them have books coming out this year that I wrote the introductions to. And for me, both of them are critics who write about out of love, out of mm-hmm. like love of the way that art is a force that can reinvent the world. You know, it's a means through which you can escape the reality that you're in. And in both of those cases, it seems a little weird that it's like these kind of like weird, straight, white, patriarch baby boomers should be so like invested in like escaping reality. But I think that that's kind of the religious part of it to me, which is, I think the religious impulse is the impulse to say, do I have to be trapped in this life? Like, do I have to be trapped in this reality? Do I have to be trapped in this body? And the answer of spiritual or religious practice is no. Like you're more than that. There's something beyond that you can kind of work with or surrender to or transform with. And I think that people who feel like hardcore alienation from their surroundings, like whatever the form, that's something that brings people to places like New York for art, right? It's like, oh, my life could be different. Like I don't have to like work at a Save and Go and like in like my shitty town with like my family that I hate. Like I could like go be around other people that I hate, but like differently. And I think that is, some beautiful aspect of art is to say that like this world that to me, art is almost like a terrain in which, or like a domain in which we acknowledge together that we could live differently.
I hope that's true.
How do you think you not going to grad school relates to what you're trying to do at NewCrits?
Kind of what you're talking about, that I think people get confused that these voices of authority are the voices that matter, or that the tone of authority. Like a lot of that, like as we just said, Rosenkrantz wrote a lot of amazing things, but there's a voice that people try to copy that ends up being this kind of post-structural voice that sucks. It makes, like, it's just hard to read, and it obfuscates ideas that could be given much more generously. And I'm starting to feel that the school environment that we're seeing now is turning more and more into a business, and that there's less and less generosity for a number of different reasons. And I think there are alternatives, and that there are different ways to do this that can get back to the source. That's kind of what I'm endeavoring, or that's what matters to me. I think the thing that keeps coming back is like, I was in Skowhegan this summer, and what was so awesome is that all I had to do was just sit on the porch in a rocking chair, and then people would just come and we'd have like amazing conversations, and we could all pontificate together, and it felt like the investment was so real and profound that people were really wrestling with themselves, their lives, and I love seeing that. It excites me beyond maybe anything else. That when I'm around other people that are looking for something, that looking for more, and they're convinced that there is more, and sometimes you find them in moments of crisis that they don't believe it anymore, and all of it, the arc of that feels so vital and so important. And it feels like the most important things that I learned were in those kinds of conversations that had nothing to do with my what we were supposed to read, what we were supposed to know, what we were supposed to get out of the class. It was like, how does life genuinely matter to this person? And how can we grow that love together?
Yeah, something I have thought about a lot, which is that people who don't continue growing emotionally or as human beings, I think it's really hard for their art to grow. And so you see this thing that happens with people who are really good artists, especially who make something really, really good fresh out of the gate, where there reaches a moment where it plateaus. And it's like, what's going on? Why is it this over and over again? And one of the things is that the forces of the art world and capitalism want them to do the thing over and over again that can be sold. But the other thing is that for whatever reason, people find places where they stop growing. They're comfortable and they stay there. And I think that is really hard to talk about when you want to talk about other people, like what's going on with artists, where you think like, what's wrong with you? You know what I mean? But that's also like part of like the cool thing about like all being in this together And that's the other thing is I think that artists, look, I would never want to say something mean about someone's work in writing. I would rather say it to their face.
Right. Yeah.
And that is not normal. Like that is not the normal thing because people are cowards, I guess. And because I think there's something that's really messed up that's happened with the way that the social media ecology has worked about how people interact with each other. And like the reason why it's so toxic, and I would even, to go into my religiosity, say it's the demonic consciousness, is because when you are face to face with someone, I mean, Hannah Arendt says something similar about this in The Human Condition, when she starts fretting, weirdly, she starts fretting about like robot killers, and you're like, what are you talking about? And well, she was like, well, because like a robot doesn't care and will like kill a person. But when two people are face to face, it's so much harder for them to kill each other. And like there's like the unconscious decision to miss or to not engage or to do differently is so much higher. It's not just an inevitability. And I think that maybe like the future of art criticism, I always think the kind of conversations about art that we think of as the golden age of art criticism, it's a small group of people who are all talking to each other. And so for me, that is where we need to go. It's like the idea of the art world is this big monolith with all these people in it. How like the fact that like you and I are like in the same world, in the same city, and like we don't really know all the same people. And I'll be like this person, like I don't really know that person. Like that's kind of incredible on a certain level, but that's also historical anomaly when you think about the New York art world. For a lot of time, when we think about like the New York as the capital of the 20th century, it was a small group of people. Sure. And they all knew each other, and they were all talking to each other very directly in their writing and in their lives. But I think I have a lot of hope. I don't know. I think that's why I like what you're doing, is this idea of like having people actually talk to each other.
That's the idea. And I mean, I knew you would be a great conversation. I knew that as long as I got the ball rolling, then you would run with it. And I don't know, I've always admired your perspectives on art. I admire your honesty. I admire your ethic. And it's just always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.